rephrase that question. I'm recording this.
Okay. One of the questions...
David Fitzgerald?
Yeah. One of the questions he raised was a good one. How could the New Testament be aimed at trying to convert these religious zealots, these, in effect, fanatical Jews who are willing to give their lives and go to war over being orthodox over Torah and being traditional in their concept of an earthly militant Messiah? Would these militants, would these radicals really be amenable to any kind of conversion, much less with all this Hellenism, all this man-godism, all this pacifism, all this our Messiah was not an earthly king stuff? How could you possibly persuade the rebels to go along with this paganized, Romanized version of their messianic Judaism? Well, my fundamental answer to him is a psychological one. When you're a monotheist, you are in a unique position. When we compare, for example, the Old Testament to literature about as old in Homer's Iliad, what you see there is the Trojan War of the Greeks versus the Trojans is explained by a conflict between the various gods. And so Hera and Athena take the side of the Greeks, whereas Venus and Ares are on the side, and Apollo are on the side of the Trojans. And so the gods are having an argument, and the humans are sort of collateral damage and get caught in the crossfire. And the Trojan War is simply a tragic result of this argument between gods. If you're a monotheist, you don't have that explanation available for suffering. If something bad happens to you, you are the chosen true believers, the chosen people, the true believers of the one true God, the almighty creator of the universe. All those false gods, those idol-worshiping deities, are nothing but false gods or reflections of Satan. So when the Jewish people suffered defeat, say when the Babylonians sacked Jerusalem and caused the Babylonian conquest, right? How do we explain that? God can't be rewarding these idol-worshiping polytheistic pagans, can he? We're the one chosen people of God. We're the ones worshiping the one true God. It can only be that we have let God down. It was our fault. He's not rewarding them. He's punishing us.
Right.
So Jeremiah and so Elijah and so all the prophets saying, hey, you kings are allowing foreign wives in, idol worshiping in, all this foreign influence in, and there has to be an explanation of some moral decline on the part of the Jewish people that explains why God would punish them. And now I don't happen to believe any more than I believe that some moral failing of mankind is what led to the flood. Right. Floods happen all the time. But giving a flood a moral meaning was important to the ancients. Although there was no real moral meaning, it just was a random flood.
Right.
Same with the conquest by the Babylonians. It wasn't a punishment of the Jews.
They just had a superior army, and
they were conquered by a superior force. But the Jewish theological understanding of themselves required that they understand it in terms of how did we irritate God? How did we piss off God? And so the whole thing about Isaiah's suffering servant, for example, is sort of a human sacrifice, an innocent man who's got to take one for the team, who's got to bear the sins of the people and die, an innocent man who's punished, sort of a human sacrifice that will cleanse the people of their sins and make them worthy of the coming of an earthly Messiah who will kick the Gentiles' butts and bring rod to the Gentiles. In this sense, we need a psychological explanation for defeat. In the wake of the first Jewish war, we're in a very similar situation as when the Babylonians sacked Jerusalem, right? We need a theoretical explanation for why we, the Torah Orthodox, Jewish, faithful, devout Jewish people, zealots for our Jewish law in the first century, faced defeat, total destruction. Jerusalem was sacked again. The second temple was destroyed. We're going to need an explanation on the level of Jeremiah's explanation for why Jerusalem deserved sacking 500-600 years ago, right? So if you're a Jewish rebel, you have a psychological, theoretical problem at the end of the first century, don't you? what did we do to piss off God? Where did we go wrong? What was our error? So these Jewish rebels, I would say, in response to how could these fanatics ever be susceptible to the Christian message? Well, Christianity specifically speaks to that. You killed your own Messiah. You misunderstood Messiah. You didn't even grasp the nature of true Messiah. And you were the ones who were saying, crucify him to Pilate. You were the Judas who betrayed him. You were the Sanhedrin who convicted him. In other words, and this is the way Christians during the Roman period all understood the Gospels. The Jewish defeat at the hands of the Romans in the first century was their direct and almost immediate punishment for having killed the true Messiah, Jesus. In fact, you could see the Gospels as doing that. Jesus comes into Jerusalem, predicts the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. He weeps for Jerusalem, and he attacks morally and physically attacks the temple. The Jewish system has become corrupt. And here he, an innocent, peace-loving man, is unjustly crucified at the insistence of the Jewish authorities, the Jewish crowd, and even one of his own disciples. So it clearly pins the blame for Jesus, the true Messiah's death, on the Jews collectively, giving a psychological explanation for the defeat of the Jews, which is precisely what Messianic Jews of the first and second centuries will need, and start needing more and more.
That's very well said.
There's a sort of a Stockholm. Have you heard of the psychological syndrome known as the Stockholm syndrome, where hostages, people who have been taken prisoner, even people who have been mistreated, will start to identify with their captors. And there's a certain psychological reality to that. Slaves who were captured, even Messianic Jewish slaves who were captured in the Jewish war, and there were tens of thousands of them. We're talking about a significant group of people, must have been in shell shock, psychological shell shock. All of their political and religious expectations have been shattered. They're in a position now to start reevaluating their own guilt and why the one true God was punishing them, had allowed them to be defeated so badly with the temple destroyed and everything, had allowed them to be enslaved. They are now in a position where they are psychologically rethinking everything. We have Josephus' own statement when he says he's going over to the Romans. He'd been a rebel leader. Here's Josephus, who was once a rebel leader, who's now going to go all the way over to the Roman side. Here's a wonderful example of exactly what we mean, how a Jewish rebel could go all the way from Jewish rebel to saying, no, Rome, God has gone to the Romans, gone over to the Roman side.
He's forced to.
And that's exactly what Josephus said.
Okay.
Right. Josephus specifically says, God has gone over to the Roman side. I'm still a good worshiper of the Jewish God. I'm still faithful to you, he says in his prayer. He's getting prophetic visions from God about how the Romans are now, the true Roman messiahs are in fact Vespasian. He might have been paid for that, but it speaks to the psychology.
He's not writing it with a gun to his head going, oh, I don't want to write this. No, yeah, he's psychologically on their side. Let me ask you something.
And I should think that a lot of the Romans who were in that position.
You bring up very important, I like this angle.
Oh, Jews who were in that position.
Two things come to mind, in my mind. That really is so, I love how close you come to making me really see how I could see a Jewish rebel who's extreme would possibly change. And maybe they had the hope that they could. That's one possibility that makes a lot of sense. And another possibility to me, looking at politics, because I look at this thing and I can't stop looking for what's really going on. You know, I'm kind of done with the whole, what's the metaphysical meaning, the hidden stuff. Don't get me wrong. I look at that stuff too. There's secret stuff that's there that we're missing, or it might be under our eyes. But what's the political angle? And to me, it seems like the majority, even in today's politics, you've got Democrats, you've got Republicans. And I don't even vote, to be honest with you. You can throw stones at me, that's fine. But he who is without sin casts the first vote, okay? I'm just not.
There is no politician who is without sin.
Of course I believe.
I love that.
I have to keep it real with you because honestly, like I've got Dr. Price, he's hardcore Republican. I've got David Fitzgerald, hardcore Democrat.
Right, exactly.
Dude, I love
I mean,
both guys.
you've got Fitzgerald, you've got Carrier, who
They're
tend to be on the left of
left,
things, where you've got Price and Eisenman, who are clearly on the right of things.
and that's
No,
okay.
Bible scholars are all over the place politically, but the point you make is really good.
I want to say that what about the general population
Mm,
in which, and even
mm,
just maybe, all right, because obviously you had to be read to understand these texts, but these texts were read aloud as well. I very
right.
much doubt that these texts were not going to synagogues and these people were not reading out to Jews that may have been in, like hearing these other Jews are going, come to your people. At the same time, this is a propaganda saying, listen, no, this is truly Jewish, yet it's starting to.
Politics and religion cannot be separated in the ancient world. In the last 200 or 300 years, since humans discovered the idea of separating church and state, right? It's only been comparatively recently that a religious foundation, a religious justification for the law, for the legitimacy of the government, has been separated out. In the United States, we don't say that that our legitimacy is based on any particular religion, and we in fact have a clear separation of church and state. This was unprecedented, frankly. In England, of course, they still have a church, an established national church, the Church of England, and the kings and queens that still exist in England, the Queen of England herself, is anointed by oil, just like David was, because she's the appointed of God. And so the religious basis for political legitimacy was a critical aspect until very, very recently in human history, and you cannot separate out religion and politics. In a broader sense, understand that what religion is trying to do is explain things, explain the universe, right? But also explain the political situation.
Mhm.
So, as we were just saying a minute ago, it's important to understand God talking through history, through battles and who wins, through historical events, natural disasters. All of these tell us something about God and God's attempt to communicate to us. And so politics and religion simply cannot be separated. And the further back in time you go, the more joined at the hip they are. Take Judaism and Hebrew literature. We are God's chosen people. We, as a nation, as an ethnicity, are separate off from everyone else. They are mistaken idol worshipers and polytheists. We've got the one true God. We are his chosen people and his true followers. In that sense, politics and religion are bound intimately with Judaism. In this sense, the Israel-only people are right. The original conception of Judaism is just as much a political one, an ethnic one, as it is a religious one. See, we in modern times have tended to separate out politics and religion neatly into two different categories. You cannot do that 2,000 years ago at all. Everything political had a religious implication, and everything religious had a political implication. So we can't just be talking about circumcision and kosher diet. Right. We're talking about the wider assimilation of Jews into the Roman world.
That's what I was wanting to ask you, though, in light of your question from David, and he brings up some, good points, and I love his work too.
He's a brilliant guy.
Brilliant.
Yeah, David, I love talking to him.
He brings up an interesting point, and to your answer, to me, it's two-pronged. It could be both. But you bring up like a very strong response to try and answer why the extremists would jump ship and literally go on their boat to Rome, so to speak, Paul. But also the general populace, the people who are not voters of either party, so to speak, or in the middle. This is propaganda to make sure and ensure.
The persuadables, the on the fences, the not so sures. Right.
And convince them this is God's movement, so that there's some type of influence convincing the general populace to make sure they follow this way, which is constantly saying, we're the door, go through this door. We're the vine, go through the, we're the
way.
This is the way, go this way. No one can get to the Father except through this way. It's like a
the door of Jesus, the way, the truth, and the light. Right.
Yeah. So I love what you're saying. Do you have something you wanted to close out on this point?
Oh, well, no, just that we are clearly talking about something with dramatic political implications. And politics cannot be separated from our analysis here. Even when we talk about simple things like the Torah criticism of Paul, it has political implications. And that's why the bits about circumcision and kosher diet in Paul can't be separated from the bits like Romans 13, obey the state, the Roman state, as God's appointed agents on earth. Paul's call for paying taxes in Romans 13, his call for that rebellion is a sin. Those political elements of Paul's message are the parallels to Paul's anti-Torah message, and are both must be seen as the motivations that go into the New Testament, and what makes the New Testament so different, especially in light of Messianic Judaism. The Jews of the period were convinced that their literature said that a Messiah was coming, and according to the ancient historians, like Suetonius, Tacitus, and Josephus, a Jew, it was these messianic prophecies that motivated the Jewish rebellion. This cataclysm that reduced the temple to the Wailing Wall it is today, that may have cost up to 1 million lives, that was followed up by a second rebellion in the 2nd century. This was a political cataclysm. And the emergence of a pacifistic Christianity, a messianic form of Judaism that is pacifistic and Platonic, can be no mere coincidence. The two events, the Jewish war of the 1st century and the emergence of Christianity at just that moment in history, are not coincidence. They're clearly related, and the only question is how they're causally related in my mind. I'm certain that future historians will come to this understanding.